I'm a consultant. I started a computer business. I use recreational drugs at parties or at clubs.
I'm a teacher. I smoke a lot of cannabis. I use ecstasy maybe once a month.
I'm a magistrate, and I've been smoking cannabis and growing it for some 20 years.
Drugs increasingly form part of the fabric of our society, yet they are a political taboo, the subject that politicians shy away from. Tonight, Panorama looks at how Britain is adjusting to what some call the high society. In a customs warehouse in London, 300 kilos of heroin, worth nearly £30 million, are taken to the furnace for destruction. Heroin, like all illicit drugs, is being smuggled here in quantities not seen before. Britain is spending £500 million a year on its war against drugs, yet the supply and consumption continues to rise.
Within this warehouse we have cannabis, herbal cannabis, cannabis resin, cannabis oil, we have cocaine, we have crack cocaine, we have heroin from the Golden Crescent, we have heroin from the Golden Triangle, we have ecstasy in all its shapes and sizes. We have the full panoply of drugs. The indices are up enormously right across the range. Enforcement effort has increased. We seize more and more drugs every year. More and more people are arrested, either by ourselves or by the police. The fact of the matter is that drugs remain on the streets.
I don't know where he got it from. Just some geezer he knew in a rave.
Only 6 years ago, official messages like these were explicit. Drug taking was both wrong and dangerous.
No, man! It seemed all right at first, but he got more and more out of it. Then you just couldn't talk to him.
The tactics of shock didn't work. As the use of so-called recreational drugs, like cannabis and ecstasy, sharply increased, so the words "say no" have largely disappeared.
Just get out!
As the old messages fade, so Britain is learning to live with drugs. Malvern College is a £12,000 a year girls' boarding school. Parents send their daughters here not just for the quality of tuition, but to avoid exposure to problems like drugs. But even in the manicured town of Malvern, they're readily available. Today, no group of 15-year-olds can be cocooned from the drug culture.
My generation, the impression I get is that drugs are so available, you come into contact with them so much that they're sort of not... Nobody's like scared of them anymore. People are not scared, they're curious.
Nowadays it's a lot more generalised than it used to be. I mean, it's not such a big deal, and more people tend to smoke cannabis and then go on to other things. They don't seem to take it so seriously.
Cannabis is more of a weekend thing. You're just on a weekend and you take some cannabis, you know, get merry or whatever. But if you're going out, then people take speed and stronger drugs like that.
A lot of the pressure also comes from music around at the moment with us. You know, people singing about drugs or whatever, and all, you know, you see all the celebrity bashers and they're all there, you know, completely stoned or whatever, and you think, you know, oh, they're cool, I'd like to be like them.
I'm sad to say that I wouldn't be surprised to find that by the time they've left here, many of them will have been offered drugs in the holidays during vacations. And I suppose I would say that the investigations that we have done for this programme have brought home to me again the reality of what they are confronting and the fact that it is so widely available for them. And I would have hoped it wasn't quite so.
Has that surprised you?
The fact that almost every one of them says that they have been offered or would know where to get if they wanted to go. It saddened me.
You've learned your ABCs.
Many of Britain's top academic schools are having to make changes they would never have imagined. Rugby accepts that a number of its pupils are experimenting with drugs. In the past, any involvement would have resulted in expulsion. But this month, it announced a policy review. Rather than condemning out of hand those who've taken drugs, it expects to offer them a second chance. As the headmaster told parents this month, the school would want to manage the problem with drug testing.
I then outlined that come September we were likely to have a policy whereby those whose performance was suffering in all sorts of ways, in work, in games, in punctuality, in demeanour and attitude and so on, that I would want parents to agree to a urine test, and that would not lead to expulsion. There would then be a second chance. And if the second test, or third test, or fourth test was positive, then they would have to leave. I think it is a reflection of the fact that we live in a world where illegal drugs are much more available than they used to be, and some of them aren't even very expensive. But I hope it doesn't in any way reflect a softness in one's approach towards the use of illegal drugs.
But, say 10 years ago, schools were still concerned about people smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol. You've now moved to a position whereby, if you are found to be experimenting with cannabis, say in the holidays, you will be given a second chance. Surely very few people would have expected that to have happened.
I think very few people would have expected a third of 16 to 19-year-olds to be using drugs. And that's really what has happened.
In fact, the headmaster's figures may now be on the low side. Each year, Exeter University analyses surveys taken in over 200 schools throughout the country. We've seen the figures for 1995. They reveal that almost 40% of 15-year-olds say they've tried drugs, mainly cannabis, on at least one occasion. Although surveys involving teenagers must be treated with some caution, these figures have risen consistently over the past 9 years.
So, what's whiz?
I don't know, he told me to write it down.
Yeah.
At a comprehensive school in Melbourne, serving villages around Cambridge, they have already made their adjustment to the drug culture.
But what is it?
Tablets.
Tablets of what?
Pills.
So if you were offered them and somebody called it whiz, I'm not saying...
There's less discussion these days about what's right or wrong. Rather, it's accepted that pupils will experiment with drugs. The school sees its role as a provider of information, that if drugs are taken, they know all the facts. So in class, drugs like LSD are discussed openly and in detail.
How would you recognise LSD if somebody offered it to you? It's got pictures on it.
Like strawberries, like the hedgehog.
Right.
But I'll send you all little pictures, smiley faces.
Do you think we can stop drug use?
No,
You think we've gone past that stage?
definitely. I don't think there's any way that we can go back as far as the abuse of drugs are concerned.
So you don't think you would necessarily have a bad trip on cannabis if it was a bad mix?
If the message isn't just say no, what is the policy?
The message is saying, be careful. The message is saying, listen and take advice. The message is saying, ensure that if you do make a decision, that you make it having borne all of the consequences in mind. But be your own person at the end of the day. Don't be influenced by others.
Anybody tell me what chuff is, please?
Cannabis.
Cannabis, right.
As in a growing number of schools, smoking cannabis during school time is dealt with initially by short-term exclusion, followed by counselling.
Quite frequently. So there are many different ways of using it?
Yeah. Well, no, not really. You just smoke it or eat it.
We spoke to some of the parents about this policy of managing drug use. Surprisingly, they now favour a more liberal approach.
Perhaps we ought to, as a society, look at licensing drugs in the way that we do alcohol. I think probably we've got past the stage where we can now just use prohibition.
From the point that it is just now so widely used, the idea of some sort of quality control rather than people taking all sorts of mixes. Again, it would be a reluctant thing, but to be realistic about it, maybe you have to go halfway to organising the situation rather than leaving it a completely free market.
Why can't you sit across a table from your children and say, drug taking is illegal, it's wrong. I want you to say no to it.
Oh, I can say that, and I perhaps am often tempted to say that, but I don't think it would achieve what I want to achieve.
Does it surprise you that you've reached that decision?
Yes, it does. If you'd asked me 10, 15 years ago, I would have been amazed that I was even thinking along those lines at all.
Outside of school, drugs information comes in the form of a consumer guide. In a Glasgow record shop, members of Enhance, a recreational drugs project, set out their stall. The material is explicit, describing both the good effects of drugs as well as the risks. The tone is set in one of the booklets. Let's get real, it says. Despite the risks, the appeal of recreational drugs is too strong. Drugs are here to stay, and there is nothing that anyone can do about it. The emphasis is on the individual making an informed choice.
It's less about the morality and more about the reality, and that's why we do this job in this sort of way. Drugs are here, they're here to stay, so we have to society has to learn to live with drugs.
Making an informed choice is also the message of a video presented by Rick Mail. It has an 18 certificate and has already been bought by schools. No attempt is made to disguise the attractions of ecstasy.
It's this big mad rush all over my body, and I thought, wicked.
Everything looks so sharp, everything sounds so sharp.
You get excited and tingly, and everything looks beautiful.
You're going to take your pill and have a time of your life.
This is definitely what exactly does it do?
The case against taking ecstasy is based mainly on the uncertainty about what's in the tablets.
Ecstasy comes in coloured tablets or capsules, but you might actually be buying anything from detergent to dog worming tablets. It can either give a wonderful feeling of warmth and empathy, or clear up your worms.
Well, what they don't tell you is that there's now loads of snide gear on the street, and most of it hasn't had a sniff at the lab. No one's got a clue what they do to you. The only guys testing these drugs are the mugs in the clubs. I'm like a rat, not a bleeding guinea pig.
Gradually, there has been a move away from any attempt to encourage people not to use drugs, to say no to drugs, to a far more liberal and accommodating position, which says, here are the drugs. This is what they might do to you. It's up to you. Go away and make a choice. We hope that you won't use, but if you do, it's up to you.
What message do you think that style of education is sending to those who are listening to it?
Frankly, what it says is go away and use a lot of the time. Because if you limit the discussion simply to the crudest and simplest physical consequences of drug use, then clearly there's not going to be much negative attached to certain types of drugs. Cannabis, for example, will not come over as being a drug that you should have any qualms about taking. You should go out and take it, according to that kinds of drugs education.
What would you say to those in teaching who say it's too late to say no, we've gone past that stage?
I think it would be a great mistake if we looked at the levels of use as they are now and presumed that simply because such high percentages are beginning to try drugs, that it's too late, we can just forget about it, forget about their generation, and just move on and just try and help them to use more safely. I think that would be a disservice to young people in society, a disservice to society in the future, that we turned our backs on whole swathes of the population and said, get on with it.
Outside the world of education, society is adjusting to the fact that for many, the informed choice turns out to be yes. This is a student club in Glasgow. Set up in a corner is what's known as a chill-out area, where those using drugs like ecstasy can relax. A bill going through Parliament, known as the Raves Bill, is expected to make it obligatory for clubs in Scotland to provide such facilities. In Glasgow, some local officials are outraged, saying that chill-out areas amount to an acceptance of drugs in clubs. But to those who dance, the only concern is taking drugs safely.
Oh,
chill out areas. It's helping people who are on ecstasy to calm down, take themselves down. To relax, exactly.
Does it encourage people to feel that they can use drugs if there are...
No, people are going to take drugs anyway. People are going to take the E, they're going to go to clubs. It's been happening for the last 5 years. People want to go and listen to dance music, house music, and take ecstasy. And a chill out area provides a space for people to calm down and to relax out with the hard music.
In high street stores like Tower Records, drugs now have their own section. Alongside Penguin Classics are the titles on drugs. It's regarded as an emerging market. Coffee table books celebrate the mysteries of drugs from ecstasy to opium. Magazines like High Times promote the use of cannabis. Other titles like Weed World provide tips for cannabis growers on avoiding arrest. Hemp Nation, a British title, offers a free bag of hemp seeds with its advice to growers.
Looking at it purely from a retail point of view, these things sell, and we sell them, and we do well out of them. You know, I don't know if we really spend a lot of time looking at, you know, the do's and don'ts of the drug culture. People want them, and we supply them. You know, what they do in their own house is up to them.
Doesn't it send a message that drugs are okay?
I don't think so. I think the message is that drugs are out there, and these are big books. These are the big publishers. They're not pamphlets rattled up in somebody's bedroom. They're major books. So obviously, you know, there is a need for them. People aren't going to spend money publishing these books if they're not going to sell. So the way we see it is supply and demand.
The sale of such books and magazines only reflects society's general ambiguity about drugs and how to deal with them. Few now question the emphasis in drugs education on reducing risk. Where there is less agreement is on whether drugs should only be presented as a matter of individual choice, with education neutral on the question of right and wrong. The current view that drugs are a lifestyle choice is reinforced by the number of professional people who maintain that drugs, like alcohol, can be used recreationally. This woman is in her 20s. She teaches in a secondary school and uses drugs regularly.
In an average month, what would you use?
I smoke a lot of cannabis, ecstasy, maybe once a month. I wouldn't touch speed at all.
And when you say you use a lot of cannabis, how much cannabis would you use?
Well, I smoke it every night.
Does it ever worry you that you have responsibility for teaching students, teenagers, and yet you use drugs yourself?
Well, no, because I know the minute I go in that door and I start to teach those children, I'm on top form. I know what I'm doing. I've prepared the night before, so I know exactly what I'm going in to do, and it's not as if... I'd never do ecstasy the night before I had a class. I'd have it at weekends, when I don't have any classes.
How do you think the parents of your students who you teach, how do you think they would react if they knew that you were taking cannabis in the way you are?
Well, I'm sure they'd react very strongly. I don't really think they'd like it at all. I don't think they'd like somebody that used cannabis to be teaching their children.
This man is in his late 20s. He started a computer company that is now worth £4 million. He regularly smokes cannabis and occasionally takes amphetamine and ecstasy.
You have considerable responsibility in terms of a business.
That's right.
And you're using drugs recreationally.
Yes.
So how do you manage that?
It's planned. I mean, just as you know, my working life involves planning and consideration. I plan it. So, I mean, midweek, I'm not going to go out to a club, sit there and take amphetamines or ecstasy and stay up all night and then go to work for an important meeting. Clearly that can't be done. But in my personal time, I choose to use those substances recreationally.
What would you say to those listening to you who would say, well, you're fooling yourself. You don't know what effect in the end the drugs will have on your ability long term?
Well, that's absolutely true, but it's a considered risk. And equally, they have no source of information. I have 14 years of personal experience to base my decision on.
In a mock lineup representing a cross-section of society, from those without work to professional people, it is often presumed that drug taking is more prevalent lower down the income scale, that it's the means of escape for those with poor prospects and in poverty living on the margins of society. Whilst drug use amongst such groups remains a significant problem, recent research funded by the Home Office has revealed surprising results.
Our research suggests it's most prevalent in the ABC1. So you're looking at, in the AB group, professionals, doctors, well-qualified individuals, people with quite a good financial income. The stereotype in the past, from previous research, has been that essentially we're looking at DE groups, people who have very low financial resources, people who are unemployed, the lower socioeconomic status groups. And our research runs completely counter to that, and states that in fact in the AB professional classes we're getting about twice the level of drug usage in general than we do in the lower status groups.
And how are they using drugs, these higher professional groups?
They're largely using them in what might be called a controlled way. They're tending to use the less harmful drugs. They're using a lot of cannabis, a bit of amphetamines. They're tending to use them at weekends and at leisure times and then stopping during the week. They're tending to not use them alongside other drugs. There's very little polydrug usage, very little injecting usage at all.
The recreational drug users we spoke to say they are law-abiding citizens in every other area of their lives apart from drug taking. Those using cannabis particularly don't regard what they're doing as wrong.
I am a magistrate. I've been a magistrate for 10 years. I'm also a regular user of cannabis and have been smoking cannabis and growing it for some 20 years.
How do you square that with your job of being a magistrate?
I believe that the immorality of prosecuting people and sending them to prison for possession of cannabis is such a serious one that I can square it with my conscience. I see that by being a magistrate and by influencing my fellow magistrates to deal with possession of cannabis by means of a fine or a discharge, more important than the immorality of being a magistrate and breaking the law.
You're in a position of trust and authority. Isn't your duty to uphold the law, even if you disagree with it?
I believe that if a law is wrong, if there are as many people who smoke cannabis today as there are who are breaking that law, what we need is to be able to talk about it and discuss the rights and wrongs of taking or not taking cannabis. And I'm being very specific when I'm just talking about cannabis.
Chris Maliniotis is a Midlands businessman who serves the market of the recreational drug user. His business is selling cannabis seeds with the necessary equipment to grow cannabis at home.
Take what you do with the way that you do it. Take what you do with the way that you do it. Take what you do with the way that you do it. That's what...
Growing cannabis is illegal, but selling seeds and indoor lights is not. So Chris Maliniotis is able to advertise in papers like The Telegraph and The Observer, targeting his market, which is mainly middle class.
Basically, you just sit the plants on here, and with the lights above, the plants begin to grow.
Last year, he sold over £250,000 worth of cannabis seeds. He sells a bag of 10 for about £40. The real purpose of this industry is only thinly disguised.
I see it says on it Dutch fish bait. Why is
Correct.
that?
Because you're not allowed to grow it, and in that sense we don't want to make you think that it's specially for growing.
But to anybody seeing the words Super Skunk, Purple Haze and Northern Lights, what do you think they're going to be buying those seeds for?
I hope not for growing. If they are buying them for growing, then I hope they take note of our leaflet, which makes it very clear that you can go to prison for up to 14 years for cultivating cannabis.
But people are not going to be buying Super Skunk and Purple Haze for fish bait, are they,
well,
at that price?
If they're not buying them, I don't think the price comes into it, but if they are not buying them as fish bait at that price, then I hope they're going to Holland to grow them, if that's what they're intending to do, if they are intending to grow them, because they won't get into trouble there.
Chris Meliniotis operates on the margins of legality. He provides everything that a cannabis grower needs, whilst warning his customers that cultivation is against the law. But he doubts whether society has the will to move against him. In places like the City of London, the recreational drug user is also uncertain as to how rigorously the law will be interpreted and applied. Ken Farrow is head of the city's drug squad. He has watched the police's view towards personal possession change. Being found with a small quantity of cannabis will now typically only result in a caution.
Ecstasy, of course, is much more of a problem and regarded as a Class A, more serious drug. Again, if it was for personal use and it was just 1 or 2 tablets, a caution would be appropriate.
And if you were found in possession of cocaine and even heroin, and it was certainly for personal use, what would happen then?
Again, there is no reason to prevent a caution being administered, even for a drug such as heroin and cocaine. But I would stress, it would have to be in a very small quantity, and we would have to be assured that it was for personal use.
How the law is applied varies in different parts of the country, although a majority of police forces would now consider cautioning if the drugs were for personal use. According to the police, drug taking has risen steadily in the city, but the line between using drugs recreationally and getting hooked is often a fine one. Up until 2 months ago, this man was a trader in a city exchange and a heavy user of cocaine before becoming addicted. Many of his former colleagues, he says, were taking drugs.
They'd be taking them in the evenings, during lunch times, after work. Mostly on Thursdays and Fridays in the pubs. Then go off to the London discos or nightclubs and use that. They think they can use drugs, you know, on an occasional basis, you know, maybe once every Friday or once every Saturday, and then it's once every Friday and Saturday, and then it's maybe on a Wednesday, a Friday and a Saturday, then it's, you know, that's how it builds, and then it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday, and then you're 7 days a week. And that may take anything from a period of 6 months to 10 years for that addiction to take over.
How much do you think you were spending?
Sometimes maybe up to £8,000 a month.
£8,000 a month on drugs?
I got a position round the wrong way because I was using drugs, cocaine, so much. I didn't know really what was going on during the day, and you know, that could have cost, that did cost quite a lot of money.
What sort of sum?
Around 40 grand, probably, 40 or 50,000.
Was lost because you weren't concentrating?
Yeah, because I wasn't concentrating.
Right, come on through.
As society has become less rigorous in dealing with drug use, so firms have begun enforcing their own standards. Kate Spanswick has applied for a job with BZW.
Take a seat.
Before taking her on, they've insisted on a drugs test.
Basically what it is, it's a series of tests and checks to make absolutely sure that you're satisfied that the sample you've provided can't be tampered with, and to satisfy us that basically the sample is fresh. And
if the result is positive, her present employer won't be informed, but she won't get the job. Applicants are notified about the test in advance and could try and clear their systems of drug traces. Even so, between 10 and 15% are testing positive, mainly for cannabis and also cocaine.
10 and 15% must be a small fraction of the number of people who are actually taking drugs in the city. We're talking about an intelligent bunch of people we're seeing here. These individuals, inevitably some of them will slip through the net. We're not catching everybody who is taking drugs in the city, and the ones that we do catch are not going to be caught next time when they're tested. So I can't give you a figure of what it is, but it's certainly larger than 10 to 15%.
Great, thanks very much. That's it. What will happen now, that goes by courier down to the laboratory where it will be tested. If everything goes forward straight first time as a negative, then we'll get the result faxed back to us sometime tomorrow night and we'll let your employers know.
Inevitably, at the end of the day, if you're trying to control, manage the drugs in society, you have to have random testing in an office environment. There is no other way that you can actually keep a handle, check what's actually happening on your foreign exchange floors, in your dealers, elsewhere, without doing some form of random testing.
This company, based in Docklands, specialises in drug testing. Among industries where safety is paramount, like the railways, airlines and the oil industry, random drug testing is well established. The majority of British companies have shied away from introducing testing for fear of giving the impression that they have a drugs problem. In America, many companies make drug testing a condition of signing a contract. One prominent American company doing business here is already demanding that British subcontractors agree to the practice. This man is a management consultant. He smokes cannabis most days and takes other drugs at the weekend.
There was once when we went for a contract where we'd done everything, won the contract, and we were tying up the legalities, and we were asked to sign all members of staff who from our company who would have to work for this particular American firm would have to be drug free, and we would have to sign a declaration that we would allow random testing. We talked about it. It was a very valuable contract for our company, but in the end we decided that we would not go ahead with that contract. And they also said that when we wouldn't sign, that they weren't going to touch us with a barge pole.
As things stand, drug taking for many young people has become a rite of passage. But the more acceptable it becomes, the less likely are they to see it as potentially damaging.
I never believed that I'd actually not play football. I did it from the age of 9. It was all I knew. I always had that belief that I would make it to the top.
Craig Sloane captained Charlton's youth team. He had trials at Manchester United and Everton. His coaches told him he could reach the summit of English football. But as a young footballer on a youth training scheme, he found many of his peers using drugs recreationally.
I wouldn't say it was widespread, but it wasn't pushed away in a corner. Everyone was quite open about it, and I suppose it was quite widespread, to be honest. But like, you have to remember, footballers are human beings first, and they were only doing what other young people were doing at the time, which is just basically going out and enjoying themselves.
Was there a sense amongst your fellow players that if somebody was smoking cannabis or something like that, that it was wrong?
No. No, not at all. I don't think everyone really played God and said, look, you shouldn't be doing that. I think it was just accepted.
Craig Sloane watched as well-known players took drugs seemingly without affecting the quality of their game. But under the pressure of top-class football, Craig Sloane moved on from cannabis to amphetamine, to ecstasy, and eventually cocaine.
At the start, I managed to still play well, but as I got in deeper and deeper, then obviously it started to affect my mind, so my mind wasn't 100% on the game of football, which it should have been. So I found it a lot harder to play my normal game, which suffered because of the drugs.
Did you think for a period that you could take those drugs and continue to play?
Exactly that. I thought you can do the both and I'll be okay, but you can't.
Craig Sloane became addicted and entered a program for treatment. Today he's unemployed, playing the occasional game in a minor league.
I think society will be going down the wrong road if it assumes that we can just let millions and millions of people get on with it and use drugs as much as they like and let it be up to them. I think if we do, we run the risk that in a greater pool of drug users, there'll be a far greater number of casualties.
2 weeks ago, this young man completed half of a 9-month sentence for growing cannabis. The difficulty for society is that when it comes to a drug like cannabis, he doesn't believe what he did was wrong.
I was very unlucky, you might say. I was caught just as I was going to harvest my crop of cannabis. It couldn't have happened at a worse time. It was the end of October, and I was just preparing to go out for a night with my girlfriend, and the knock on the door came, and there was a team of police officers armed with sledgehammers and a search warrant.
The young man is Sir David Steele's son. Sir David acknowledges that neither he nor his parliamentary colleagues know enough about a subject which divides his generation from his son's.
A lot of the older generation don't understand that younger people do know about drugs and they know about cannabis, and we get fed up with the hypocrisy of it all.
Sir David says that nothing he has learned since Graham's arrest has persuaded him of the case for decriminalising cannabis or any other drug. But he does feel that society can no longer afford to avoid grappling with where it really wants to stand on drugs.
Whenever anybody does raise the issue, either in Parliament or in the party conferences, they tended to be slapped down as though it's like shouting in church. Nobody wants to be tainted with this subject. I understand that, but I do think we need to have an informed report on which we can then base a debate. I think if we continue to shut our eyes, turn our backs on this issue, I think all that will happen is a growing disenchantment of an entire generation with the operation of the law.
The fact is that society is confused as how best to respond to the growth. It is too risky politically. But whether that debate takes place or not, Britain is adjusting to the high society.